Hi everyone, welcome to the Fort Collins Book Fest 5-year celebration. My name is Sochi, and today we are celebrating our first 5 years of the Fort Collins Book Festival, a virtual celebration of books and brews, writings and riffs, food and thought, big science, and the great outdoors. As always, we are also celebrating the importance of literature, writing, books, and our libraries. Check out the virtual program at focobookfest.org. We have over 20 sessions and 4 workshops, all free, book talks, discussions, panels, prose, and poetry readings. Make sure you attend as many as you can. Before we get to our session, I'd like to thank our sponsors. This festival could not happen without our generous sponsors. They make this festival completely free. You can check the entire list at the end of the session. Today's event is produced by Poudre River Public Library District in partnership with CSU Morgan Library. Our presenting sponsor is City of Fort Collins Fort Fund. Further support has been provided by Friends of the Poudre Library District, Friends of Morgan Library, Willoughby Morgan Endowment Fund, Downtown Development Authority, Ann and Bruce McDonald, Lidget Johnson and Goodman PC, Front Range Community College, FOCO MA, Downtown Fort Collins Creative District, the Gardens at Spring Creek, and Old Firehouse Books. And our media partners, KUNC and 105.5 The Colorado Sound. We'd like to give special thanks to Northern Colorado Writers for presenting all 4 of our Writers Workshop. Thank you to all of them. And thank you so much for supporting our 5th annual FOCO Book Festival. Now, without further delay, let me introduce Matt Stillwell, who will lead the conversation with Autumn. Matt has taught nearly every English class offered by Front Range Community College here in Fort Collins. Since 2005, he has focused on teaching composition and literature classes. Matt and his wife, Jill, enjoy chasing after their 2 active sons. Matt has also been part of every one of our 5 Fort Collins book festivals, and we're honored to have his many talents from brewing beer to deliberating on philosophy. We will have a live Q&A after Matt and Autumn's program, and here's Matt.
Awesome. Thank you, Xochitl, and thank you to our viewers out there. It is our distinct pleasure on behalf of the FOCO, my distinct pleasure on behalf of the FOCO Book Fest, to be introducing Autumn Bernhardt, the Fort Collins Poet Laureate. Autumn's work has appeared in regional, national, international, and Indigenous book collections, such as Grazing the Fire, Bawajagan, Blood, Water, Wind, and Stone, and Beyond Queer Words. The Tulane Journal of Law and Sexuality, Prism International, Yellow Medicine Review, The Moon Magazine, Red Rising Magazine, as well as a host of other notable publications that have featured her writing. Currently, Autumn teaches Indigenous culture and social and environmental justice courses at CSU. In addition to academic and literary work, she also ran a crossbreed longhorn cattle operation for 8 years and served as a tribal attorney for the White Mountain Apache tribe. Autumn was involved in sacred land and water litigation on behalf of Colorado River Basin tribes in the well-known San Francisco Peaks case. As a Colorado Assistant Attorney General, she was lead counsel in U.S. Supreme Court litigation relating to a water compact dispute between 3 states and has been engaged in a number of U.S. Supreme Court, federal court, and Colorado Supreme Court cases over the course of her career. All these experiences have and continue to influence Autumn's writing. She holds a Juris Doctorate from the University of Colorado Law School, and you can find more written and spoken word poetry, as well as other information at Autumn Bernhardt on Instagram. So Autumn, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for the 5th Book Fest.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Awesome. Well, in our preparation leading up to today and our conversations, you mentioned that the poetry that speaks to you and your poetic voice is about truth and uncomfortable truth. And in one of your recorded poems, we're going to look at in a minute here, Where Are You? I just wanted you to sort of share some background with the audience. What were the circumstances under which you wrote this particular poem?
Well, I was actually sitting in the back of a truck filling up water tanks for cattle. And I ended up writing quite a few poems in the back of that truck because I didn't have water in the pastures. So I always had to fill up the water tank in the back of the truck, drive the truck to wherever the cattle were, and then fill up their water tanks. And I had a lot of free time. And that's when I wrote a lot of the poetry that you see and hear.
Awesome. Awesome. Hey, Doug, could we take a look at that clip for Where Are You, please?
I stay vigilant for you. Hold a lamp for your crooked feet to return. Hope that in walking through fire you burn off your old self. Shed seasons and return to the winter campground with pregnant belly and every bit of my love for you. Leave your old country like a refugee. Come back home to a glowing lodge, a teepee painted with plants and prophecies. Lay your head on my chest, beating war songs and love songs. Walk with me through my remaining days. Never let me utter this same prayer again. Fill me with tumbling stars, pink clouds, and the memories and plans of you.
Thank you for that, Autumn. And a follow-up question. So what sort of uncomfortable truths does Where Are You address for you?
That was just kind of a classic heartbreak poem, really. I had lost a friendship that was very meaningful to me, and it was hard to get over it. It was very troubling for me. And I was listening to a lot of Eric Church at the time. Eric Church has an album, Mr. Misunderstood. And so, when you're upset like that, you listen to songs over and over and over again. And I was listening to, was it Record Year? And there's a song on there called Mixed Feelings. I'm having mixed drinks, or I'm having mixed feelings about you and drinks, or something like that. And it was that same sort of notion that, I couldn't reconcile how I felt. And so instead of having mixed drinks about feeling and you, like the Eric Church song, I wrote, lay your head on my chest, beating war songs and love songs. That was my version of that song. It doesn't sound anything like the song, but that's what I was feeling.
Yeah, I think that gives us a good background into even your process in terms of the way you create your poetry, right?
Yeah.
Awesome.
In the back of a truck. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
Okay, so you go from the back of a truck to the courtroom, and so I'm sure that our viewers today would be interested, based on your biography, what role does your poetry play in your career as a lawyer?
There's quite a few poems that are really pretty steeped in law. Manifest Destiny is a poem that I actually get called upon to recite quite a bit. And the second stanza of that poem is actually a direct quote from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, right? Talking about free, prior, and informed consent. And so that poem has a lot of law in it, like sometimes explicit language of law. Before we talk about grazing, there's a lot of law talking about the role of the BIA in Indian affairs. Those are two great examples of that. And I don't know if I'm skipping ahead too much, but that poem, Manifest Destiny, this week, I wrote it when Standing Rock was happening. And a lot of people were coming to me and they're asking me, like, what's your opinion? And they kind of wanted a soundbite on my opinion of what was happening with the Standing Rock protests. And it was really hard for me to give them just a short version of what I felt, because I felt so much. I had actually, when you gave my bio, you talked about the San Francisco Peace case, and that was actually a sacred lands case. And the causes of action were NEPA, National Historic Preservation Act, of course, treaty rights, as well as Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And so, when I looked at what was happening with the Standing Rock litigation, in addition to the protests, I saw that those causes of action were the exact same as those in Standing Rock. There were some nuances and things like that. And we had actually lost the San Francisco Peace case. And it was pretty upsetting. Losing the case meant that the U.S. the U.S. Forest Service went ahead and permitted the use of basically reclaimed or tainted water on one of the 4 sacred mountains in the Southwest. And people wanted me to be like, what's your take? And I felt kind of overwhelmed by the question. I was like, I can't distill it. And if I do distill it, I'm going to distill it in this poem.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for that, Autumn. And we also, when we had a chat before our session today, you also incorporate poetry into your classrooms too, even when you're talking about legal cases, right?
Yeah. Well, I have like more of a law and policy type of class, and then I have some culture classes. And I'll use Joy Harjo or Billy Ray Belcourt or Layli Long Soldier. And I think that poetry does a great job of communicating culture in a very subtle but effective manner. So rather than me say, this is what I've experienced or this is what I feel it's like, I'll be like, here's a poem. And there's so much under the surface, there's so much under the surface. Because I think Native people, probably in a lot of ways more than any other kind of group in America, have like these really intense and sometimes negative interactions with law from the federal government. So, it's just there. Culture and law is intimate. It's combined.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna take a listen to Red Thunderbird here in a second, and I want you to kind of think about, like, that was a nice segue into maybe how Red Thunderbird expresses some of those emotions between the law and between your poetry. So, Doug, can we have a listen to Red Thunderbird, please?
So the next poem that I am going to be reciting is called Red Thunderbird or Wakian Luta. It was originally published in the Yellow Medicine Review. It was subsequently published in a book called Beyond Queer Words, and that was just recently. The poem again is called Red Thunderbird or Wakian Luta. Code switching and code talking only to myself and the expert on cortisol, adrenaline, oxytocin, serotonin, but maybe we could talk about testosterone too, just to get it out of the way. Hearing the words, but only part, talking over the drum beat, talking over the mind churn. Red thunderbirds flying down the highway, I hear the beat of their wings. I ask for their help the way a thunder dreamer asks by saying, I don't need no help. By saying, don't worry about me, I'm all sorts of safe from myself and from the world. Most things I don't know. Still there are things I know I need, like a new fleet vehicle that flies down the highway like a red thunderbird, but with a red-tailed hawk feather on the rearview mirror, to remind me to seize things from the air, to get me back on the red road, the black road, or wherever I'm heading lately. The smell of Ipswich pine, heartburn and mind churn, the ups and downs of routines and vicious cycles. Only 7 years till fluency, only 10,000 hours till mastery, and days of flashcards with Zuzecha and Hoka on them. There's sore necks and compromise, and I'm talking to all the single mothers I know, once broken, a couple times heartbroke, wondering if they know about my perpetual heartbreak. My whole plan for the future right now is portable enough to be seized and burned up. My life is in the notebooks, and I'm dragging the fringed heel and moccasins to cover my tracks, waiting for a red thunderbird to pick me up.
Autumn, please, if you would, share with us, we were discussing a bit before about the role that poetry plays with your legal career, and how does a poem like Red Thunderbird express some of those connections?
I think in a lot of ways, Red Thunderbird isn't as explicit about the law as some, but the culture is definitely in there, right? I think it helps if you know the role of thunder dreamers in Lakota society and the role of thunderbirds, that it helps. But poems are kind of like they're multi-layered. I think sometimes you can get the gist of it without knowing necessarily all the cultural references. But that poem right there was just kind of I was just trying to figure it out. That also. I don't write a lot of light poetry. I have written light poetry, but At least the lineup here isn't necessarily light poetry. Yeah, I tend to be motivated by frustration and, frustration.
Right. Well, I mean, you mentioned maybe a little bit of that with Where Are You and in Red Thunderbird. And again, in our previous conversation, I heard you mention this idea that like to some extent, your poetry is a release valve. Whether it's the San Francisco Peaks case or it's a relationship, your poetry sort of plays that release valve role. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I wish I could give the proper credit to the person who said this quote, but she said something to the effect of writing is an act of hostility imposed upon an indifferent world. And that's kind of how I approach poetry, and to a certain degree, a little bit how I approached law as well. I tried to be amicable and reach agreements where we could and things like that. But the type of practice that I was involved in was because I cared about what I was doing. I cared about environmental stewardship, and I knew what I wanted to see in the world.
Awesome. We've heard already a bit of some of maybe your possible influences, Eric Church, Lakota myth and legend. And so which poets and musicians have most impacted your voice and growth as a poet?
Oh, I just take a little bit from everybody, really. I mean, I really do. I'm not very, in some ways, kind of loyal to one particular genre of music or one particular poet. I will say that I really, like so many people, I love Neruda. Neruda is just the quintessential poet. And my minor in college, because I was an honor student, I had to take a lot of Spanish classes and foreign language classes, and my minor was Spanish. And so I encountered Neruda actually in Spanish. And it was just the way he phrases things, and it's just so simple and beautiful and elegant. I love Neruda. I grew up actually without a TV, so I was really exposed to the radio quite a bit. So I just remember like sitting in the back of like the vehicle and like, writing like kind of words on my leg while I was listening to, country music. And, country music, people make fun of it because it's formulaic, but all music's a little bit formulaic. But, there's still some really great phrases and just kind of expressing humanity. So those are a few, but I love a lot. I really enjoy Billy Ray Belcourt. He was one of the first journals I published in. It was actually, I guess it was a magazine called Red Rising Magazine. It's a Canadian magazine, and it's actually taken off. And he published a poem called "Okay Cupid" in there, and I'd never really heard about him before, but I got a contributor copy of the magazine, and it's basically about hooking up as a native guy on OK Cupid. But he got it, you know what I mean? That was like just the background for like, he was telling a story through that, and it was so deep. And I enjoy his poetry. Yeah, but I always come back to Neruda. It never leaves my shelf.
Awesome. And you're still working through it in Spanish?
Yes, because sometimes the translations aren't exact.
Yeah. Well, and you also mentioned Andrea Gibson and Ophelia Zapata as other inspirations.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So Andrea Gibson is kind of a local poet, and just like amazing type of stuff where I didn't relate to everything, but I related to a lot. And she'll have these lines like she pole dances to gospel music, right? Or take your pinks and blues and your boy girl rules and shove them in your car with your fucking issue of Cosmo. Just stuff that like kind of sticks with you. And so Andrea Gibson used to listen to Andrea's CDs back in the day, way back in the day. And then Ophelia Zapata is wonderful because she actually she's a linguist as well. She works on like revitalization of the Tohono language, and she's a poet. And so I enjoy her work. It's funny. and she has like a poem, and I think I was telling you about this too, that says, when you have an illness, send it away. And that's kind of what I do with my poems. Like, there's something I can't figure out, and I send them to Canada or Hawaii, or I send them away.
And when they end up in those publications, that's the completion of the metaphor, right?
I hope so, but I'm still living with them too. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, yeah, like What Are You is like 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's a little different. I have a different perspective on it, because that poem, when I first wrote it, I was like, this poem is, I couldn't stand it in a way. I just couldn't stand what I was feeling, I think, more so than the words. And now I have like a little bit of a different relationship with it.
Nice. We're going to listen here in a moment to another poem, Iktomi and the Duck. And as we're listening, I want you to think about some of those inspirations, your Neruda or your Zepeda or Gibson or Belcourt. And then when we come back from that clip, we'll continue the conversation about how that poem reflects some of those influences. Doug?
Iktomi and the Duck is based on an old Lakota narrative. It was written down by Zinkala Shah. And some of you may already know this, but Iktomi is the trickster in Lakota culture, and that's really the basis of this poem. I walk out of the dark of work with red eyes like Iktomi's wood ducks. I've been researching their questions, dancing in the firelight, looking for a song that I lost but couldn't bear to listen to anymore. She sees my wood duck eyes and asks me if I'm stoned, as if that's the only thing she knows about me. So with burnt wings, I spin around someone else's flames. Fancy dance more like Iktomi's ducks than the painted ladies that found their home in the asters. But someday, I'll fly with burnt wings, changing from smoke-blind duck to phoenix, filling my life with my own bundle of songs and my feathers with each breeze of July.
So going back to those influences, Autumn, and to a poem like Iktomi and the Duck, how does that show some of those influences in your poetic voice?
Honestly, it's a little bit like those kind of like really like more like hip hop in a way, like telling folks like, I'm gonna overcome. You don't believe in me, giving me a lot of shit, right? But someday I'll change from smoke blind duck to phoenix, right? That's that line in there, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what that poem was, like another kind of, like in some ways it was, I was thinking about that the other day. It was one of those poems that's sort of like, here's the circumstances, but kind of almost cheering myself up too. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
being like, people just, they're not getting me, right? She, what is she sees my wood duck eyes and asks me if I'm stoned, as if that's the only thing she knows about me, right? Or, the start of the poem, I walk out of the dark of work with red eyes like Iktomi's wood ducks. I've been researching their questions, dancing in the firelight, looking for a song that I lost but couldn't bear to listen to anymore. And like that right there was sort of like, I was actually going through some edits with an editor. And I was really frustrated, really, and that poem was sort of like, I'm just dealing with this stuff, and I'm trying to be successful, and I'm trying to do things. And this poem makes more sense if you understand like it's an old parable, it's an old story. Iktomi and the Ducks, and it was actually written in a book by Zinkala Shah. But anyway, Iktomi's a classical trickster in Lakota society. And he basically, I hope I'm not ruining the story, but he invites these ducks to basically close their eyes and dance for him, right? And while he's doing this, the ducks basically get knocked out or choked out, right? Because he's just hungry for ducks. And he tells them if they open their eyes will turn red, right? Like wood duck eyes are now.
Yeah.
And he opens their eyes. One of the ducks opens their eyes and sees what's going on, right? They're being deceived by Iktomi. And he flies away and leads some of the remaining ones that are alive to fly away too. And so that's kind of what's going on there. It makes a little more sense if you know that story, but that's kind of what it is that I felt I was putting all my effort into something that wasn't paying off.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that insight. But so with Red Thunderbird and even Iktomi, you're updating these myths and characters, like you said, with a hip hop reference in Iktomi and the Ducks. So like you're recreating it ways for a new audience, right?
Yeah, and I think that's important because culture isn't fixed and it shouldn't be fixed. And you know, and language is the same way. Language doesn't stay the same forever. So, you know, after I'm done with all my classes, I actually go to like a Lakota language class 4 days of the week. And we talk about this, and we talk about like how much of the language should be preserved in the old way, and what do we want to change? Like, you know, you're kind of these part of this like cultural renaissance in a way, literally of language. And poetry informs language, right? Kind of like I think we didn't get the word lonely, but for like Shakespeare, isn't that right?
Yeah.
There's a few words that he just invented. I'm not a big fan of Shakespeare myself, but I can understand his role in culture. But it's like the same thing there, is that like, and it's a way for me to talk about things that are personal to me. You know what I mean? And the metaphor helps me talk about it in an easier way. You know, kind of and maybe other people can approach it in an easier way too, because some of it's very deep stuff, or like just hard, you know, that troublesome truth or that uncomfortable truth. It's uncomfortable for me too, you know, and so the metaphors help.
Awesome. That's an excellent segue, Autumn, to just when we thought it couldn't get any better today. We also have some live poems that you've prepared. And so thinking about that theme of, you know, the uncomfortable truth, but also how poems, you know, help you process certain thoughts or emotions. Would you like to select one of those three poems to read for us now?
Yeah, so this is, can you guys hear me okay? I got a little feedback on that one. This is a poem that is called Flying Through the Shitstorm Upside Down. And I'm reading it. It's going to be coming out in a book called Tales from 6 Feet Apart by IO Literary Press. And I wrote it right after really kind of the shutdown and the quarantine. And I was once again trying to come to terms with things that were difficult, and I think everybody else was too. So it's actually in some ways a little dated already because so much has happened in the world. But so this is Flying Through This Shitstorm Upside Down. Well, we're flying through this shitstorm of time and space and chaotic formation exactly 6 feet apart, except in a grocery store, a drugstore, or someplace else we need to go. We're out of toilet paper, out of a job, out of money, out of breath, but we're not out of the woods, not for the duration, not for a good long while. Late spring will turn into late fall will turn into Christmas, and Christmas might never be the same again. We're weeks behind and still years to go on testing, scrolling through articles to find big contradiction, overwhelming uncertainty, and small hope in tomorrow's science, next year's science, or who really knows if science can save us now. There's faith in the good Lord and our exceptional history. Firecrackers are lit up at 7 p.m. even though Independence Day is far, far away. Red, white, and blue flags are flying on lawns and balconies, but there's just way too many red hats on white people in this blue-collar neighborhood. We're all in this together except when we're not. Radio's been stirring them up with kung flu fighting words, and I know how this story goes. So I've been putting my faith in dog tags, drop fades, and Damascus blades. There's just way too many red hats on white people in this blue-collar neighborhood. And these collars don't run, but they do clash. So I've been folding bandanas, watching disaster capitalism unfold, and hiding epicanthic eye folds behind shades on quarantine walks. You know you can always count on racial profiling, but not racial profiling right. Poverty is a pre-existing condition, and reservations get hit hard. Folks can't breathe with virus-filled lungs and knees on the backs of necks, shot to death in bed. We're all in this together except when we're not. There's way too many red hats on white people in this blue-collar neighborhood. And those hats are starting to look more and more like white robes on white people under these blue, blue skies. Experts recommend that you wash your hands for 20, then hold your shit together for the next 5, then the next 5, then the next 5. It's all lather, rinse, repeat, endless repeat. My friends and I have been taking good notes on pop culture, watching World War Z, Zombieland, Contagion, to both distract and prepare us for what's coming. Hell, we are pop culture now, and suddenly no one wants to wear a crown in this celebrity Tiger King kingdom. We send health checks on Thursday afternoons, see each other through choppy video feed, somehow feel we're not alone. There's a lot of crazy shit out there, a lot of crazy shit. Still we're slant flying red, white, and blue, flying through this shitstorm upside down right next to each other with a big thumbs up.
Wow, thank you, Autumn. That's a lot to process. I wasn't able to review that poem before we met today. So
Yeah, sorry, it was a last minute add-on.
no, that's great. No, that's we like some improvisation. You hit on so many, like you hit on so many of the current themes and probably emotions that people might be feeling during this time. So how does a poem like that reflect your current voice based on some of your because there were some great lines I heard in there. Disaster capitalism and poverty as a pre-existing condition. I mean, you're taking some of those issues head on.
Yeah, for me, like I actually taught at Front Range kind of back in the day. That was my introduction to teaching, actually. I taught Introduction to Political Science and American Government. And so, even when I was in like undergrad, my honors thesis was actually on how to prevent the Holocaust. I think I carrying a lot of cultural stories with me, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And probably more so than some people, I guess. And I'm just kind of really worried about democracy and rule of law, being an attorney, and for me, like, I'm actually more politically moderate than I think people think that I am, honestly, right? Coming from a rural background. But it's disturbing to see things that are just fundamental aspects of American democracy gone, and I can't remember what someone was saying, like we were talking about what we missed about America, and, these various things. And I was like, I just miss America, I miss America. And it had its problems, and things to be resolved and things like that. And, there's an expression in law that's basically like, don't waste a good crisis, right? And we're in crisis, and I hope that the crisis opens up an opportunity to do things better. But going through this process is upsetting. It's upsetting to me, just I think for all Americans. It's upsetting to me, like having some sense of like kind of constitutional law and being a part of the application of law, and also being a person who is, a target of, what the president is saying, in the presidential debate. Like, you can't back away from the fact that he's like saying Pocahontas as a racial slur. Like, you can't back away from that. You can't back away from the fact that he's calling out, neo-fascist groups and like in a presidential debate. It's not necessarily my opposition to more moderate or even conservative politics, because he's not even good at being a conservative, right? Yeah. He's a threat to democracy. And so for me, that's disturbing.
And kind of, and like flying upside down in a shitstorm.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that poem has an appeal because of the way you kind of bring it down to the street too, while you're talking about some really serious concerns and issues right now.
Yeah. Well, referencing Zombieland, right? So
yeah.
American pop culture. Yeah, culture and law together.
Yeah, that's really good stuff. Well, you mentioned your rural background and your upbringing and how you might be more moderate than people might expect. And there's another poem that we want to be sure to get to today, and it's before we talk about grazing. And I think that's a poem, at least as I understood in our first conversation, that reflects your ranching background to an extent, and also connects you maybe with your family in ways. And so I think we should listen to that poem and then continue that conversation. Does that sound accurate?
That'll work for me. Yeah. So
Nice.
before we talk about grazing, it was actually published in a book called Grazing the Fire, Poetry of Rangeland Science, and it's sold by Wolverine Farm. So this is a local publisher and a local business. I just wanted to point that out. And I use a few tonal autumn words in here. I actually got the opportunity to call Ophelia Zapata and ask for the correct pronunciation. I was kind of nervous on the phone. And so I probably won't pronounce them right, but I'm going to try anyway. So before we talk about grazing, before we talk about the future, we need to talk about the past. This land is marked with stories. They're in the washes after it rains, in the small undulations, in the rasp of desert breath. If we talk about us, we need to talk about them. The boss farmers up north, the boss ranchers down south, BIA paternalism everywhere. Before we talk about how we graze as a tribe, as a local district, we need to talk about how they overgrazed. Scraped vegetation right off the surface, no regard for growth points, no regard for anything. And we need to talk about which of us we are talking about. Tribal politics, tribal politicians, tribal corruption, tribal employees wanting to follow tradition and be good stewards. Oh, and did we mention the local politics of tribal politics? We need to talk about that too. Yes, it is good to consider how to graze, but the personality of the desert is always changing. She has and will always be here. We need to talk about the desert. Before we talk about grazing in the desert, though, we might need to talk a little more about before there were cattle, before there were Spanish missionaries, before loans and gifts, the new and old cattle economy, how it all got started, the origin of things. And we definitely need to mention Indian cowboys. The old ones with experience and practice, the young ones sometimes uninterested, sometimes just uninvited. Indian cowboys studying at the tribal college and showing up for roundups. Then again, what about these Milgon theories? Do they respect Teohimduk? Are they in harmony with the past, the present, the future in the desert? Before we talk about science, before we talk about grazing, before we talk about elaborate methodologies, let's not talk about elaborate methodologies. Let's get to know each other. Before we talk about grazing, we need to talk about intergenerational trauma on people and on land. 500 years ago was just yesterday in the desert. 500 years ago was just yesterday in the heart.
Wow, thank you. So as we were, and I hadn't heard that poem before either, but that poem, the line that resonated, or one of the lines that resonated with me, was talking about Indian cowboys, and that is a huge part of your background. Your grandfather, your father, your mother. I mean, you grew up ranching and rodeoing all together, right?
Yep. And so, and that's how my family actually got here, is that this is kind of a part of the history of America, is that a lot of times European farmers who are, in the West trying to farm weren't really comfortable with horses. So they brought down like Lakota people or people from Montana, tribal people, to go ahead and break horses, and actually to drive mules and draft horses to go ahead and dredge irrigation canals and reservoirs. And so that's kind of my history. And then there's also, and I write a chapter on this, and this is more water law specific, but it was the policy of the federal government, and this is a direct quote from a case, to make Indian people pastoral and civilized, right? Good Christian farmers. And so, that's part of my legal practice, right? Because I deal with water rights. It's part of my personal background. And so, yeah, I was really fortunate. Maria Fernandez Jimenez asked me to work on that poem, and I was like, definitely. It's kind of a commissioned poem. You're writing on the basis of a scientific paper, a poem. And I was excited to do it, because I was like, finally, I get to talk about something that's real to me, in a way that the people are asking,
Well, and that right there is the perfect. It's similar to using your poetry in some of your classes. Like it connects those two parts of your art and your legal practice. Fair?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it's your history. I find the ranching and the horse breaking history fascinating in our even in our previous discussion, but also now.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that.
Yeah, because you talk about the big farmers up north and the big ranchers down south. Was that the line?
Boss farmers, I'm actually
Boss.
talking about, yeah, it's okay. It's a BIA superintendents, like up at Pine Ridge, they'll call them boss farmers.
Oh, okay. Okay, the boss farmers.
Yeah, because
Right.
the BIA kind of ran in a very paternalistic way, natural resources on a lot of reservations.
Right. And so that poem brings together many aspects of your experience, but also some of those same ideas that you've talked about from San Francisco Peaks, like water, land, like you live on the land, and you see also the legal implications of these policies on the land and the water and the people.
Yes, yeah. So it makes me a little neurotic. Yeah, right.
And so you need this poetic outlet.
I do, because when I'm like turning on the faucet, I'm like, oh, there's prior appropriation right there, or I'm like fishing in a river and I'm like, oh, is there a dam release, or what are the contaminants in the river? And so I write like a poem like love song for landscapes, which is very kind of romantic, and there's sunlight on like spider webs and things like that. But I don't always have that experience because I'm kind of worried about things. You know what I mean? I have those experiences, and that's wonderful. I'm just experiencing it and not too troubled. But then sometimes the attorney kicks in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Autumn, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on behalf of FOCO Book Fest. I appreciate the conversation and your poetry. And I'm going to turn it back over to Xochitl for our question and answer session. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed having you and talking to you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Autumn. It's amazing. You're amazing. I have a question from Katie. She's asking, what types of things do you do in your role as Fort Collins Poet Laureate, and what are your goals?
Honestly, getting voted in as Poet Laureate came as a little bit of a shock to me. I didn't really realize people were reading the poems. I'd publish them and then I'd throw them up on social media. And so it kind of shocked me. And I'm still, and then COVID hit. And so I'm like, man, what am I going to do? But I think what I've done so far, because my family's been personally hit by COVID. So I have a little bit more, I'm a little more cautious. What I've been doing is a lot more spoken word, and that's actually something that's very new for me. So the 3 poems that you saw, those are brand new. Those are all post-COVID poems because for the most part it was all writing, and if I had to do a reading, I would do a reading. So I'm trying to do more spoken word because it's nice to connect with people through video, instead of forcing them at a difficult time to sit down and read something. So that's what I'm trying to do, is do a little bit more spoken word. I didn't really have a whole lot of grand plans. I enjoy poetry. I enjoy people that enjoy poetry. And I don't know, that's it. Poetry for me is, about justice and cultural expression, but it's meant to be enjoyed too.
Absolutely. I have another question from Downtown Fort Collins Creative District. Do you feel poetry is an extension of traditional Indigenous oral storytelling?
Yes. I think that's very much true. When I grew up, I just remember sitting around, and that was it. I was sitting around the table with my grandfather talking about horses and things like that. And it just, so I got this sense of the rhythm of language. I'm not particularly musical, but language has its own rhythm, and when you're editing a piece, you kind of can hear the rhythm of the words. And that's what stories do. They're like little mini stories, and I think that's also why you see so many native poets out there, or maybe that's just who I'm paying attention to. But it seems like they're there because that's like the medium too that's open for them to talk, right? You can't talk anywhere else you can write a poem. And in some ways, because it's such a marginalized art form, it makes it perfect for a lot of marginalized people, like with slam poetry and hip hop and things like that. Like you have like a lot of trans poets and people who are not necessarily in the majority who gravitate toward that because, you know, they're hearing what they're feeling. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I have another question. Your professional background is amazing. How do you come to poetry as a medium for expression?
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. Really, you know, I always loved poetry and I always loved music, right? Yeah, I was telling that story about sitting in the back of like the truck, like writing on my leg, like the lyrics of like country music. Um, but I think for me, like I didn't really up until, you know, I kind of had like that loss of a friendship. I didn't really have the courage to send it out, right? And I think it was just sort of having no other option. That's what I did, and I sent a series of 4 poems to Red Rising magazine, and I think it just came out of like not knowing what else to do to feel better. Yeah. Because I mean, here's the thing: is like writing poetry and doing law. Because I was a litigator, right? I was in court. This is not something that is normal behavior. Exactly. Does that make sense? I would have never, you know, if I was representing clients now, which I'm not, just teaching the law, I couldn't have imagined doing this, you know, because I was in court all the time or I was writing briefs.
Yeah, those are two very different things to me. But I do have my oldest son is actually starting to apply to law school, and he's a rapper. So it all makes
Nice.
sense to me.
Yeah, yeah. And then the law is a lot about language.
Yeah.
Yeah, they actually go together, even though it's kind of, you know, you have to be a little bit buttoned down sometimes, you know.
Yeah, I think
Good
that.
luck to him.
Thank you. Okay, another question. You mentioned that frustration is a motivator for your writing. Has the pandemic and being on lockdown impacted your creative process?
Uh, I think, like I said, I think I just kind of changed a little bit more to spoken word because there were more opportunities, and it seemed like people were more receptive to spoken word. So I'm still figuring it out. It's not something I've done. Mostly I've published in magazines and journals, so I'm still figuring it out, kind of how to deliver spoken word. As far as, no, not really. You know, I just have different kinds of frustration.
Yeah, I think that everybody seems a little frustrated too. Um, so I have a question from Peggy. How can we engage more young people in the art of poetry? Does it look different in the age of social media?
You know, there's a tremendous amount of poets on Instagram, and I always think Instagram is kind of like the place for visual artists and poets because, you know, poets, you know, you can just throw up a stanza on Instagram, and I'm not that effective, but I observe them doing it well, and someday I aspire to do it well, like some of the people I follow. You know, I think when you talk about music, music is already a type of poetry. They're already engaged. People love music, you know. Um, but sometimes there is times when I wouldn't have been ready to receive slam poetry. There was times when I wouldn't have been ready to receive Neruda. And so I don't know. I don't know. I think you kind of got to go with what they're already interested in. And if they're interested in music, there's some really beautiful lyrics out there. Not necessarily beautiful, but beautiful in the sense that they convey something that's relevant and that resonates. They can actually be pretty harsh lyrics sometimes.
Yes, I agree with that. Yes, definitely. Let's see, another one. How can poetry elevate the voices of people who have historically been unrepresented?
Um, I think it already does that in a way because it's accessible, like in some ways, like being like I said, like a marginalized art form. You know, I don't know. For me, poetry, like I occupy a really interesting space where I'm kind of at the crossroads of a lot of identities and experiences, right? And so it gives me a different perspective. So I, in some ways, like I'm not a great poster child for one particular like identity or cause. Does that make sense? Because sometimes these, to me, they're wonderful contrasts where I think I have deeper perspective, but I think the outside world sometimes sees them as very delegitimizing. Does that make sense? Being like too spirited and being rural, being an attorney and being a poet, being gender non-conforming, right? I mean, in these like crossroads, right? Or being like in some ways like someone that practiced Indian law and environmental law, but not being enrolled in a tribe, right? Even though I know that I'm Lakota because of my family history. And so I'm kind of like at these like crossroads of identity. And I think a lot more people are than it kind of admit in a way. And I think being at those crossroads is kind of like the beauty of poetry because you don't have to necessarily adhere to somebody's idea of consistency or this is what this identity should be, which is based on like not their own experience, you know what I mean? But what they perceive, they're putting that on you. This is what you should be. And I think that's what's beautiful about poetry because it's just so, it doesn't adhere to a whole lot of rules in a way. It's much more experimental.
Thank you. I have one final question. What are you reading or listening to right now?
Oh, okay. I'm keeping it light. I like The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. It's like sci-fi or urban fantasy. So I like that. I can't listen to a lot of his books back to back. I need a little space, but I enjoy that. I'm also listening to I like Barry Eisler. He writes the John Rain series. It's interesting. What did I listen to like yesterday? I was listening to like Lauryn Hill and Loud Luxury, and then Eric Church. So yeah, I'm not gonna be reading like War and Peace right now. I'm already preoccupied with what I got going on.
That makes sense. All right. I just want to thank everyone today for joining us. I don't know if we have time for another poem. If you want to end with a poem, Autumn, another one, or
Yeah, and this one is in some ways a little bit lighter. So I got that. All right. Even though it was written after the pandemic. So a someday cup of coffee. Can't stop thinking about you and don't much want to. Let's leave behind the hedonic treadmill, the 3 to 5 a.m. moonlight bathing, brain racing. Find a way despite confused words, contrary natures, full schedules, and planetary arrangements. I just want to escape from pandemia with your heat next to me. I just want to get beyond the now. Let's love the possibility of us enough to make space, even if that means tearing a hole in a stardust galaxy for a someday cup of coffee, a chance to get to know each other better on an idle afternoon.
thank you so much, Autumn.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me.
Thank you for being here. And thank you, Matt, for having the conversation with Autumn and asking all those great questions. I want to let you know that if you would like to purchase any of our authors' books, just go to oldfirehousebooks.com/bookfest 2020. Book plates are available from select authors. Please indicate in the comment section if in your order if you are interested in a signed copy. We have 2 more sessions today, so tune into that. Please go to focobookfest.org and fill out the survey. This is really important. We rely on your input for planning for future book festivals. Thank you so much.
Thank you.